Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I think we might as well start just now. Very grateful to Paul LaViolette for giving this talk. This follows a talk that he gave to the Society at the end of May on galactic superwave theory. And we were very keen to get Paul back, and this seemed like the earliest opportunity we could do it. So I'm very grateful to you, Paul, for doing it at fairly short notice. We're very excited and looking forward to the talk. So I think you've probably heard enough from me, and I'll hand over to you, Paul. So thanks once again.
So is the mic volume okay, or?
It sounds good for me.
Okay. So here you have the my two websites, if you're interested, Theric.com and starburstfound.org, where Theric.com has a lot of information. We'll both have a lot of information about electrogravitics and subquantum kinetics, the theory I use to predict this effect. Here's some books relevant to the subject: Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion and Subquantum Kinetics. We don't have time to go into all the anti-gravity technologies that's in my book. Some people had been sending around the title being Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, but I'm going to focus more just on this title, The Discovery of Electrogravitics and Its Application to Gravity Control. So this is more or less in the first 5 chapters of my book. And also there'll be some stuff that's not in the book because I had not put it in, but it's a lot of events that happened after the book was published. So here's a quote from Ben Rich, who was head of Lockheed Skunk Works, January 1995. He said, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects and would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity." So this gives you an idea of where our state of technology is. Apparently we have interstellar travel, and it's supposedly superluminal to make it practical. It totally breaks all the boundaries of what we had believed. This is a quote I'm giving here from Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Forrestal. In 1942, he was told by his World War II intelligence operatives, every book in the libraries and the colleges and universities, every book on this planet is misinformation. All over this planet, books are not telling the truth, whether it's medical, whether it's interplanetary astronomy or science. Every person, every PhD on the planet has been given misinformation. Purposely implemented with the objective of retarding and controlling humanity's progress. Now, of course, we know about Thomas Kuhn's thesis that new theories, it's difficult to get them introduced because the existing theories sort of turn into dogma and they try to patch up their deficiencies and sweep under the rug the theories contrary to them. So even without the help of what we call thought police or whatever to try to keep in place the status quo, the whole process tends to resist change, which is sort of like why we have the feeling that our science has been frozen at the 1950s level, sort of like in Matrix. It's like technology was frozen at a certain year, nothing after. So to focus on electrogravitics, we have to discuss about Thomas Townsend Brown. He's the fellow that introduced us to this field. He was born in 1905 in Zanesville, Ohio. And as a young boy, I guess from the age of 10, he had a dream of going to Mars, developing some new propulsion technique to go to Mars. He was experimenting with X-ray tubes. He had an X-ray tube. And when he energized it, X-ray tubes require 100,000 volts or more to operate. He noticed that as soon as he energized it, it moved. And he was intrigued by this, and he started researching this. And his family had some money. They were a well-to-do family in Ohio, and they funded his research. And he came up with these capacitors, which would move when they were electrified. Here on the right, you see the two gravitators or gravitors, as he would call them. And when he'd energize them, they'd move, the capacitors would move respectively to their positive pole, in the direction of the positive pole. So you get a torque out of this. And this shows how it's made. It's just like a regular capacitor, but however, it contains a lot of lead oxide in between the plates to make it massive. So having a lot of mass in the capacitor was important. And in some experiments, he hung this from the ceiling in a bath of oil to demonstrate that it wasn't due to an ion effect, what he was finding. So he had a shielded container. The oil bath was shielded and grounded, and sort of like a Faraday cage. And he put 200,000 volts on this, and it would move in the direction of the positive pole. Now, what's happening, it doesn't sustain its force. This is what he found. It would swing to the pendulum would swing to the positive side, I don't know, a foot or two. And then it would hold that, and gradually it would subside back to the plumb position. It'd take a long time, but eventually reach plumb again. And here's my explanation of why that happens. It's because when you charge a capacitor, its dielectric gradually polarizes inside between the plates. The dielectric is developing the opposite polarity from the charge you put on the plates. So if this is an electrogravitic effect, in other words, a charge is creating a gravitational force on the capacitor, after a while, the capacitor is going to eliminate that force because of the polarization of the dielectric. So in 1922, he entered Caltech. He was hoping that Millikan, who was a big superstar there, would take an interest in his new theory, but Millikan didn't like the fact that it would mean he'd have to trash general relativity. And he rebuffed Brown, and Brown was crushed by this. So I didn't see any point to stay at Caltech if nobody took an interest in his ideas, and he transferred to Kenyon College in Ohio. Then he transferred to Denison College in Ohio, where he befriended a physics professor named Paul Biefeld. And the two of them worked on his electrogravitic experiments. And some people call it the Biefeld-Brown effect. I guess Brown felt he wanted Biefeld to share the notoriety because he was his professor. Well, Biefeld comes alphabetically before Brown. It's really Brown whose work it was that they were working on. Then between 1926 and 1930, he had his own private laboratory and continued his research on this. 1928, he submitted an article about his findings to Physical Review, and they rejected his paper. due to the unconventional nature that it challenged Einstein's theory. They never thought, well, maybe Einstein's theory is wrong back then. They were so convinced it was right. So Brown then submitted to a magazine that's sort of like Popular Science, actually. It's called Science and Invention magazine. It's not around these days, as far as I know. And they published about what he was doing, an article called How I Control Gravitation. And you can find this on the internet. And it shows some of his pendulum experiments. He also had a boat he could propel through the water. This diagram on the left you see is his experiment he did with cannonballs hung from suspended from the ceiling with a glass rod between them. And he'd get an effect even with that. So there would be a measurable effect even with that. So down here, you can read what says, he says, wait a minute. A system of two bodies possesses a mutual and unidirectional force, typically in the line of the bodies, which is directly proportional to the product of the masses, directly proportional to the potential difference, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. So this is not rocket science, because this effect violates Newton's third law. If you look at this being his capacitor, suppose it's a capacitor, he had a heavy high K dielectric. So it had to have mass for the dielectric and also have a very high dielectric constant, K, because that allowed him to put the maximum amount of charge on the plates for a given voltage. And the theory below is the idea that negative charges are anti-gravitic. They produce negative gravity potentials. This is a new idea. It's nowhere will you find this in physics, but it explains very readily Brown's experiments. And the positive charge produces a gravity wells, just like regular neutral matter. And that as a result, you get a gravity gradient between these two potential, hill and well, which propels the capacitor towards the positive pole. And I'll explain about this. Comes out of subquantum kinetics, this conceptualization. So this is not explained by general relativity. General relativity, as you know, it's possible only to form gravity wells, not gravity hills, and only when mass is present. And it predicts no connection between the electric charge and gravity. Although Einstein was aware of Brown's work, and he was greatly troubled by the fact that his theory didn't predict this effect, electrogravitic effect, because the two of them worked together with the Navy on what they called, the cover story was that it was mine-sweeping research operation. But it was funded with $50 million back then. And don't tell me they needed 50 million. Now, what's the equivalent of 50 million now? We're talking about $500 million at least project, maybe 1 billion. For World War, this was during World War II. And in my book, I explain how actually this was a cover for the Philadelphia project. The Philadelphia project is denied by the Navy. They say it never existed or whatever. But there's a lot of evidence that it did exist, and Brown has not denied that he was on that project. They even went to the trouble, Navy went to the trouble of changing his resume that they had posted for his life experience so that he was not in Philadelphia during the time of the Philadelphia project. And I brought this to the attention of one author, and he realized he'd been totally misled by people around him about Brown's life. But it shows you to the extent that they were going to cover up the existence of that project. But anyway, Einstein knew of Brown, and that's probably why he was looking for some solution, some way to unify electromagnetism with gravitation in the latter years of his life. And he had even doubts about his own theory, as you know, back towards the end. So subquantum kinetics is the theory I use that predicted this effect, because I didn't know about electrogravitics. I was working on subquantum kinetics well before I discovered about electrogravitics, but it was predicting that electrons should have anti-gravitic potential. They should be gravitationally negative, whereas protons should be gravitationally positive. And this troubled me. And it was right before I was about to publish my theory. I still had this thorn in my side that this seemed to go contrary to what physics was saying. And it was later I discovered about subquantum kinetics. But to summarize about subquantum kinetics, it's been in existence for over 30 years. I would say longer, over 35 years, so I should change that. It has a sound conceptual basis. It developed by applying systems concepts to physics. 12 of its predictions have been subsequently verified. 10 papers about it have been published in refereed physics and astronomy journals. It is a unified field theory that acknowledges the reality of an ether. And it is entirely consistent with Tesla's thinking. It unifies physics with the life sciences, and it appears to have very ancient roots. If you go into ancient mythology, you see it seems as if they've encoded concepts that of this type of physics. I should mention that in the black projects, I am told, I've had contact with some whistleblowers from the black projects. They say they don't use general relativity. They use an ether theory to explain how these things work. At this point, I don't know if they had developed something similar to subquantum kinetics. I don't even know if now that subquantum kinetics been out for 35 years that they've clandestinely bought my books and spread it around their departments. Probably, I wouldn't be surprised. I have gotten interest from US Space Command. They were interested both in my book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion and Subquantum Kinetics. So that's an ongoing thing. I'm hoping that something will develop out of that interest. In general, if we look at conventional physics is within the box, subquantum kinetics not only explains what's in the box, but a lot of stuff that's out of the box that is puzzling for standard physics. And standard physics is completely at a loss to explain UFO propulsion, anti-gravity effects. There's theories put forward, but it's a lot of gobbledygook. With one assumption upon another, trying to somehow save the physics concepts. So subquantum kinetics begins with the idea that everything is process, is flux, that nothing remains still, like what Heraclitus was saying. So this has this concept has very ancient roots, as you see. You find the idea of transmutational ethers in the ancient Chinese tradition, ancient Hindu tradition. So it goes way back. This is what we call Model G. It's at the heart of subquantum kinetics. You're postulating certain reaction processes that we're dealing with an open system where this is an ether. Okay, imagine ether with alphabet soup of types of etherons where you get transmutation, like A goes to G, transmutes to X, transmutes to omega. And you also have reactions, like B reacts with X, produces Y plus Z, and then Y reacts with X to produce X back. 2X plus Y goes to 3X. So this is the Model G, and it's based on the Brusselator idea, which has been developed in physics, in chemistry, physical chemistry, by the Brussels School. I'll show you that in a minute. But think of Model G as the genetic code of the universe. In other words, we make a postulate at the subquantum level. We postulate an ether, and that the ether has this specific method of reacting and transmuting. This is the model you're proposing. And out of this comes the whole ball of wax. If you simulate this in a computer, it produces what we observe as physical reality. This is the approach. The founder of Mathematica actually was thinking along these lines too, believing that this was possible to develop physics in this direction. But he came after my work. So here's ether reactions in process going. Here's the Brusselator, and you can see the difference is it's a little simpler. It doesn't have G in there, but the rest is exactly the same. Here, compare the Brusselator on the left with Model G. See, it's identical, just we've added G. That's why I call it Model G. And the Brusselator could produce wave patterns. And this is where my starting point was the Brusselator and reaction diffusion systems and chemical wave patterns like the BZ reaction. And I thought, suppose you could get these wave patterns to be coalesced to form sort of like a soliton that would represent a particle. That this would be a whole new approach to physics. And instead of being based on mechanics, it would be based on physical chemistry, basically. So I toyed with this model for a couple of years, and that's when I finally came upon the Model G. And here, if you unravel that picture, it's essentially 5 equations. We call these kinetic equations. And the letters represent concentrations of the particular etherons. So instead of dealing with chemical concentrations like the Brusselator does, you just bring it down a few levels of reality to the subquantum level, and you say you're dealing with a reactive ether. There have been some suggestions of ethers that are reactive in the past. Chinese fellow, and then there was a fellow that discovered genetics back in 400 years ago. But really, to understand Model G, we had to wait for the era of the computer to be able to simulate these effects. Now, you notice the reverse arrow. This is very important. So most of the transmutations are forward, but in addition, you have a reverse transmutation where X can go to G. It's not as great as the forward, but it's very important because it allows G to be dependent on the status of X. Now in this, X and Y represent the electric field, and G represents the gravitational field. So X will become, I'll come back to this and just show here this diagram. This is when you simulate that in the computer, and before 2010, when Matt Pulver simulated on his laptop equations, I was doing all this in my head. So I had pictures similar to this in my book and in the published articles. And they were all verified by Matt's work. Here you have the Y concentration, or you can call it the Y potential, because these are equivalent to energy potentials. If you assume a zero potential is at the homogeneous steady state that exists before the particle emerges. So this is positive and this is negative. So X goes negative when Y goes positive. And there is also another polarity to this where Y would go negative and X positive, and that would be the antiparticle. So think of this as a particle like a neutron. And you also have the possibility of the antineutron. But the difference is that the neutron is stable, the antineutron is unstable. And the reason being that the neutron here, because X is negative, and because of this reverse reaction here, X is negative, G is going to be negative. And that's why you are getting this G well formed here. And the importance of G being negative is that G is your bifurcation parameter. Does everyone understand bifurcation parameter?
No.
We're dealing with nonlinear systems. And think of a nuclear reactor. It's probably from most understood by the general public. When your reaction in the nuclear core is subcritical, your reaction is going to peter out and you won't have any nuclear power. If it's supercritical, it's going to exponentially increase and you have a Chernobyl event. Okay. So that's why they have control rods to regulate the reactivity right at the marginal threshold. And there's what they call the critical threshold, that if the reactivity goes above that, they start going into exponential increase. If it goes below it, it's exponential decrease. So in this the model, G plays the role of the bifurcation parameter. And this is not invented, it just, that's the way it is. In the Brusselator, it was A was the bifurcation parameter, but A was held constant throughout the reaction volume, so they couldn't get any localized structures. What I did, I held A constant, I made G a variable, and G was influenced by the polarity of the charge, electric charge. So it was actually an electrogravitic, that's the electrogravitic connection right there, is that reverse reaction. And you needed it in order to produce stable particles. Because the only reason the neutron is stable is because it's producing a small gravity well. It creates a supercritical region that allows it to maintain itself. If it was a G hill, it would very quickly dissipate. We've done computer simulations of this. I'll show you later. This is the charged state. So the neutron, when it becomes a proton through beta decay, this whole pattern, wave pattern, gets biased upwards. So here would be the proton. You have a gravity well, but the electron, which is a negative charge, has a gravity hill. And the reason subquantum kinetics proposes, the reason that you have gravitation from a neutral charge, a neutral atom, is because the proton's G well is slightly greater than the electron's G hill. So the result is you get a G well with neutral matter, and that's the gravitation we normally experience. But if you're able to strip the electron away from the proton like they do with what Brown was doing, in a capacitor, you find that the proton G well is actually maybe over 1,000,000 times stronger than normal matter would produce. Could be 1,000,000,000 times. I haven't done the calculation. So, so I just want to point out that subquantum kinetics had this electrogravitic effect put in, but it had nothing to do with propulsion at that time. It was totally to make stable particles. That was the one goal, subquantum kinetics. And all sorts of things followed out, like the wave pattern here. Suddenly we have particle waves. In other words, a particle that has wave properties. So it predicts all the particle scattering experiments, the Bohr orbits, everything falls out of this. You get a total substitution for quantum mechanics. The whole idea of the supercritical and subcritical, you're finding this is like you see in the video, the particle is produced out of a fluctuation. And you have a fluctuation emerging here, which is a seed fluctuation, like from the 0 point. You have this is got 0 point fluctuations. So it automatically generates matter. So you have a substitution for the Big Bang. You have a continuous matter creation cosmology. The supercritical and the subcritical effect on photons produces a redshift. So you have the substitution for the cosmological redshift. You find evidence of cosmological blue shifts, so it explains that. I just wrote 2 papers on this, I mentioned before. Goes into all that. It explains enormous energy that black holes put out. They aren't black holes in actuality because they can't collapse. They're stars that are hypermassive stars that are putting out enormous amounts of energy. It basically revolutionizes all of astronomy. And I don't have time to go into all that. You know, that requires another talk. But here's some other experiments Brown was doing, where he had airfoils that he'd charge at the leading edge of the wire, and these discs would go around. He put about 100,000 volts on these, and they'd zip around a carousel. Here's close up. He got some publicity on this in LA Times. His laboratory was in Los Angeles at that time, 1952. So they're talking about here might be a way to explain flying saucers. And here's one way you can view these as working, that you put a positive charge on the wire and the negative charge on the rear wire. And he also connected the rear wire to the body, aluminum body of the craft. So that was also negatively charged. So you get a G well in front, G hill in back, and it moves it forward. But there's another effect, it's called the electrokinetic effect, and it has to do with the repulsive effect that the positive ions have on the positive wire. Because as the craft moves forward, these ions move back and they end up exerting a repulsive force on the wire to move it forward. Also, they end up exerting an attractive force on the body of the craft to move it forward. And the negative ions in back, as the craft moves forward, they are sort of left behind and they exert a repulsive effect on the trailing wire. So Brown called this electrokinetics to distinguish it from electrogravitics. And so you have both effects going on, but in experiments, he demonstrated in vacuum chamber experiments where you didn't have these ions, it was just left with the electrogravitic effect. Now in 1952, this was just 9 months after his public appearance in the news. I suppose he wanted to get the word out because he knew that they would clamp down on him if he proposes to the Navy, which he did. And this was his proposal to the Navy, the Joint Services Research Development contract. And he had his Brown Foundation doing this. And in this proposal called Project Winter Haven, he proposed to develop a saucer interceptor with Mach 3 capability. He was extrapolating the performance of his laboratory disk prototypes, and he predicted that larger flying disks operating at a potential of 5 megavolts could be made to attain speeds of 1,150 miles per hour, Mach 1.5. And that was a lot faster than any jet had gone. I don't know when they broke the sound barrier, but this was in 1952. And he reported that with voltages and equipment then available, larger disks could be built that would be capable of speeds of 1,800 miles per hour, Mach 2.4, if you were in the upper atmosphere. Now, one important thing in this proposal, if you read page 3, he admits here, oops, he says, in certain years, as additional data of a confirming nature have become available, the research has been associated with government research projects of a highly classified nature, and publication has been precluded. So that's why none of us have heard about Brown in college. He wasn't allowed to publish. Einstein was allowed to publish, but Einstein's theories were wrong. You know, military knew it, his stuff didn't work. I know a fellow whose father worked on the Black Project's work out of the Naval Lab on the East Coast, and was involved in the UFO doing the analyzing the radar findings from the UFO blitz that was happened in 52, I believe it was, of Washington, D.C. And he had all sorts of highfalutin people coming from Princeton. One of them knew Einstein even personally. And this fellow said, you know, that they don't consider Einstein's theories feasible for what they're doing on this electrogravitics. So as far as back as that, they diverted from standard theory. That's probably why they pick people out of high school for working on these black projects, people that show promise. They don't want them going to college to pollute their minds with the standard views, which Admiral Forrestal had said back in 42, it's mostly BS anyway. And it turns out that if you delve into it, you find that's true. Now, shortly after that proposal was submitted, he did a demonstration at Pearl Harbor Navy Base in 1953, where he flew his discs around a 50-foot course diameter. This was a diagram drawn by Brown, submitted to Thomas Terman, who was communicating with him by mail. And he was saying that they were getting, well, based on the RPM of this revolution, you could figure was getting about 11 miles per hour if the radius was that much. But there is a report in Interabia magazine about this demonstration. It says he was getting him to go a couple hundred miles per hour. And if you do that, you have to figure this is going about 1.4 revolutions per second, and that these were fully extended out to 100 feet, really whipping around. I mean, okay, you can have model airplanes with high-powered engines on the model airplane could probably do this kind of speed. But he was doing it electrostatically. And if you do the figures, how much power it takes to overcome just the air drag. Here's the equation for air drag. D is density of the air, A is the cross-sectional area perpendicular motion, C is the airfoil drag coefficient, and V is the air velocity. So that goes by the cube. Your drag goes by the cube of the velocity. And you come up with a conclusion that well, he was supplying 200,000 volts to power this, and 30 milliamps. So his power supplied was 6 kilowatts, but it took 50 kilowatts to overcome just the air drag. So as a minimum, he was getting 8 times over unity. In other words, he's breaking the first law of thermodynamics with this. And you can understand why immediately the results were classified. And we're lucky to have gotten that blurb in the news magazine about the 200 miles per hour. So the Navy became extremely interested in this. Then 3 years later, this came out, Aviation Studies International. I was at the Library of Congress doing research. I tried to find something, some remnant of information about electrogravitics. I went through their whole stacks, their card catalog, and the only thing I came up with was this document. And I asked them, could I please have this? And they came back and said, well, it's been lifted from the stack, stolen. No. So I said, could you do an interlibrary loan search? They searched all the libraries in the US. They said, well, this must be a very rare document. We find it in only one library. I said, where is that? Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's the same place they reported to have taken the wreckage from the crash at Roswell. So I did the interlibrary loan request, and surprisingly, they sent it to me. You see this black bar, this blacking out what said here before, which was confidential. So at one time, this was classified confidential. So I may have been one of the first civilians to see this. I immediately made 20 copies before I sent it back. And I was sitting on this. I was in Portland, Oregon at the time, where I was doing my work on subquantum kinetics. But anyway, this is an eye-opening study. Here's talking about all these aircraft companies that were doing research on electrogravitics between 1954 and 1956. So immediately after Brown had submitted his project, Winter Haven study, it catalyzed all of these companies to start working on this. They saw this as the technology of the future, that we could propel craft with electricity, basically. And this was an international effort. You also had companies in England, in France. Hughes was very much involved. I knew the son of a fellow that worked there in anti-gravity. He wouldn't tell his son anything, but one day he drew a picture of a lenticular object. He said, we got it to lift off. He was very enthused. And so much later, I told him, could you ask your father, did they do electrogravitics work? Because would he say anything about that? Because Hughes was listed here. And he had been working at Hughes at that time. And all his father said, we are the world leaders. So very interesting. Here is a work that Brown was doing while this other was going on. He was in France. And this was revealed to me by my contact, Black Projects whistleblower, in 2008. So it didn't make it into my book. But here's some photos from his work in Paris with SNCASO organization. Here's a picture of him with one of the discs, and here they're holding the disc. So you're getting 75 centimeter discs suspended by 4-meter tethers, energized with a few 100,000 volts and attaining speeds of 35 kilometers per hour. They also did vacuum chamber experiments, which were very significant, which demonstrated that the effect was sustained even in a vacuum. So no one could claim that this is due to ion propulsion. In fact, it got better speeds when it was evacuated. Here's some interesting stuff in the report. Says that regarding the discs, so they're propelled forward primarily by unbalanced electrostatic forces due to the prevailing nonlinear field configuration, which causes thrust in the direction of the low field intensity ion cloud, regardless of ion polarity. This is the electrokinetic effect. So this is an ion effect. On the other hand, so this would be regardless of your polarity, whether you had the plus on the front or the minus in the front, you still get this effect. It says, on the other hand, the report says that vacuum conditions, under vacuum conditions, the disks always moved in the direction of the positive pole, regardless of the, let me get this out of my way. So, okay. Regardless of the polarity on the outboard wire. This indicates that in the absence of unbalanced forces exerted by ion clouds, the disks move forward mainly on the basis of electrogravitic field effect toward the positive negative G direction. I guess I'm paraphrasing what the report said here. These are some of my words. Then it says, these vacuum chamber experiments were a decisive milestone, and they demonstrated beyond a doubt that the electrogravitic propulsion was a real physical phenomenon. The report concludes saying, it seems perfectly reasonable to conclude that a concentrated force of some kind accumulates within the presence of a strong dielectric, presumably in the presence of a high K dielectric. And Brown finished his collaboration with them in '56, and from a letter that Mr. Cornelian, who he was working with there, later wrote to a colleague, he says, we learned in October of '57 that Brown was in the process of test flying 10-foot diameter discs energized at voltage of 300,000 volts. So here we see Brown was following the plan that he first set out in his 1952 Project Winter Haven proposal, where he was saying in the proposal he planned to fly a 10-foot diameter test disc powered by 500,000 volts, which is 70% more than he used in his '57 test flight. So we see here that Brown, and by this time he's progressed past his toy model stage, and he's getting into stuff that just a little larger, and you're getting in stuff like the B-2 bomber. So he was likely receiving a lot of military money at this point. But the whole subject went dark. It was a sort of, must have been an order put down on all media not to report, and all the companies, they wouldn't divulge any information on this topic after probably '58. And here's was written in July '59 in Canadian Aviation. He says here, the author has not been able to determine whether Glenn Martin has discontinued its anti-gravity program or made a significant discovery which has elevated it to super top secret category, since no information about the project has recently been available. You'll find all of this material I've gathered, these clippings and so on, in my book, The Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. Now here, this is a patent that Brown took out in 1965, a patent for a 15 million volt flame jet generator. The idea is similar to a Van de Graaff. So instead of the Van de Graaff belt carrying ions, it's being carried on the jet exhaust. So you electrify the jet exhaust, very ingenious. And you pick up some of the charge there, 15 million volts you pick up. You put it through a voltage reducer to feed back 50,000 volts to your ionizer. But the rest of the 15 million volts goes to the leading edge of your craft. And to electrify your craft, you put the positive charge on the front of the craft, and the negative goes out the exhaust. And he was actually suggesting this is another patent of Brown's, and also in '65. Here are your flame jet generators. He's got 4 exhaust ports spewing out the negative ions, and he's putting the positive ions on the front. sort of like his electrokinetic disk idea. And it's a short jump from this to the B-2 bomber 25 years later, 65 to 89, approximately. And there was a leak from Black Project's whistleblower saying that the B-2 charges the leading edge of its wing to a very high potential and dumps the ions of opposite charge out through the exhaust. And you put two and two together and you realize that this is Brown's patent, actualized. That's why they called it the B-2 Advanced Propulsion Bomber, because it had a totally new method of propulsion. And in fact, here's a shot from a Northrop video of the bomber in flight where it was going through some humid atmosphere. And you see a glow discharge on its surface. And that was eventually taken down because too many people were commenting about it. So here you see what's happening. The ions are going in the slipstream around the craft, sort of a shock front here. And they form sort of a parabolic shape in front of the craft, similar to some of his parabolic thruster experiments that I'll show you in a minute. And the negative charges go at the back. So you can say here you have electrogravitic effects where there's a gravity gradient going this way, which would propel the craft forward. But at the same time, you have electrokinetic effect. And here you look at it a little differently. And here the positive charges in the front are exerting a forward repulsive force on the leading edge of the craft. And the negative charges are exerting a forward force on the tail of the craft. And they are very concentrated. So this is a very concentrated forward force. And it overcomes any reverse attractive force from these ions to the negative charge on the craft. So here you have, again, like his disks, that this is moved forward by electrokinetic effect. And interesting is that they're scooping air in through the jets and ionizing it. And at one point, they can actually shut off the fuel source. So they're powering this just on scooped air. So it's a perpetual motion machine because this effect is over unity and they're using it to drive the engines of the B-2, basically. So here's some items that he was doing vertical lift experiments with using parabolic shaped electrodes, and the positive electrode being much greater diameter than the negative. So the forces are much more concentrated on the negative electrode. So even though the positive and negative have the same amount of charge, the forces pushing upward are much greater than those pushing downward. If these are positive ions pushing against the positive charged electrode. And the same over here. And in this design, he was reported to have lifted the entire weight of the disk along with 10% weight extra. And so if you look at this with standard electrostatic theory, where they view the forces rooted in the physical objects, like as if the force from the negative electrode and the positive electrode are somehow attached to these electrodes, you shouldn't develop any propulsive force forward. You should just develop stress. But if you accept the idea of an ether and that these charges are in the air near the craft, you see that the craft is independent of the field differential it's generating, and it's able to move forward. And this has been demonstrated by his experiments. So Townsend-Brown experiments also indicate that a positive field, the positive field, which is traveling in front of the saucer, acts as a buffer wing, which starts moving the air out of the way, because it creates positive charges here, which repel from this area and they move around. And so it reduces the drag on the item. It can reduce the shock front from a supersonic craft. It can just slip through the air. And this idea has been implemented into reducing drag on trucks and on air travel. NASA's been studying this. Back in 1992, you also have heard about the Columbia disaster. That occurred in 2013. Now, back in 1992, I communicated with Morris, who was assistant director for the National Aerospace Plane Program of NASA. And I was trying to interest him in electrogravitics. And I sent him, I guess, that electrogravitic system study or something I sent to him. And he said, review to date determined the concept's not appropriate for consideration within our program. As opportunities arise, I will continue to seek interest in baloney. So I was not discouraged. I gave it one more try. I sent him even more information in 1993. And you see all the stuff I was sending him, all sorts of reports, the electrogravitic system study and articles, so on. I say, if after reading through this material and discussing it among yourselves, you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My number is blah. If you want further validation about the capabilities of this technology, I could attempt to put you in touch with people who have been quietly doing work in this area. I got no response back, but notice this here. I say, besides the benefits of gravity propulsion, electrostatic charging of the plane's leading edge would also have the added benefit of reducing air friction heating of the hull surface. Now, that is exactly the problem that caused the Columbia space disaster. And here I'm writing to Gemin, who's on the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. I'd like to submit the enclosed suggestion to Columbia Accident Board, which describes a method of improving aerodynamic characteristics of the space shuttle, which should be effective in preventing similar reentry disaster from happening in the future. And I point out that I made this suggestion to NASA some years ago, 10 years earlier, but unfortunately overlooked. I was being kind there to say it was overlooked. They just weren't interested. So basically, if they had done something about this, started electrifying the shuttle, this would never have happened. Now, I have not yet been contacted by lawyers representing the crew, but I would have testified. So look at the thrust to power ratios of these technologies. Here, the one of the vertical lifters that Brown was working on using barium titanate, high K dielectric, you get 70,000 newtons per kilowatt. Compare that with a jet engine, it's only 15 newtons per kilowatt. Compare it with a space shuttle main engine, 0.22 newtons per kilowatt. You're talking about 500,000 times greater thrust than the space shuttle main engine. If you look at the jet engine, that's thrust to power ratio is 15. Efficiency is 30%. Take this type 2 electrokinetic thruster, use barium titanate, you have 140,000% efficiency. That shows you you're dealing in never, never land here in terms of technology. Now, if you want to go to Mars, here I propose how you could go to Mars in 5 days using Brown's thrusters. Spacecraft, it's 100 tons. Thruster size, each thruster would be 40 centimeter diameter, 20 centimeter deep, similar to those parabolic thrusters you saw there. Each one would develop 35 newtons, and you figure 6,000 of these thrusters. nest them in a 30-meter diameter container, 5 meters deep. So those will be your thruster section behind the craft. And you could power it with solar cells because they're not taking too much energy. So you get a total thrust force of 21 tons acting on the 100-ton spacecraft. You get acceleration of 0.2 g. The power requirements are only 3,000 watts. Use solar cells. Thrust to power ratio 70,000 newtons per kilowatt. Power cost after 5 days would be at 7 cents a kilowatt is $25. So here you're accelerating for the first month or first day, excuse me. Now they talk about taking 7 to 9 months to go to Mars, you know, with ion propulsion. Here you go in a matter of days, 5 days. You're accelerating for the first day, and you coast at 200 kilometers per second for the next 3 days or so, 2.5 days. And then you decelerate for the next day or so. So you go 60 million kilometers for $25. Now compare this to the space shuttle. With the fuel and rocket boosters, you're dealing with 2,000 tons. As opposed to 100 ton for a Mars vehicle. One shuttle launch requires $450 million for the fuel costs. So compare that to $25. So there you see. Of course, they wouldn't use a space shuttle. They use an ion thruster. So, but still, it puts to shame the ion thruster. It's about several hundred times more efficient. You've seen from the thrust to power ratio, thousands of times more efficient. Suppose you want to go to Alpha Centauri, 4.37 light years away. For this, I was recommending using the Paklanov gravity impulse beam generator. This produces repulsive forces. If you discharge 2 million volts, the electron discharge hits the cathode. It's focused with superconducting materials in a coil. But even though the electrons stop, there's a gravity wave that continues. It's focused into a beam. And Paklanov was able to get it to repel pendulums. The 10 million volt unit, which is locked in secure facility in Russia, he's Russian. So he was obligated to share with his country. He's living in Finland. Finland was under the part of the Soviet Union at that time, back then. But now it's free, of course. That was able to put 4-inch holes through concrete blocks and dent a 1-inch thick steel plate. So we're talking about enormous forces. So imagine you used this type of unit. So, oh, by the way, these are Tesla waves. In other words, longitudinal waves you're dealing with. They're not electromagnetic. And I also had done experiments with Obolansky in his laboratory where we were discharging a couple 100,000 volts to a dome electrode in shock fronts, creating shock fronts. We call them Coulomb waves. And they would go sailing across his laboratory at superluminal speeds. We were measuring the speed with the oscilloscope here at different points. And they'd start out at 6.5 times the speed of light. And as they left, they went away, they'd decrease their velocity towards the speed of light, but still they'd be superluminal. And this fits the whole idea of ether propulsion. In other words, the unit is creating an ether flux, which the wave surfs on this ether wind. And Paklanov, where he had focused, instead of ours was radiating out, so that's why we couldn't get it to sustain over long distances. Paklanov's focused, he was getting up to 2,000 to 3,000 times the speed of light for his pulses. So imagine you use this for your propulsion system. Let's say you use Brown's units for subluminal propulsion because they're much more energy efficient. And then, so for the first month, you go on Brown propulsion, then put in for a month, no, even a quarter of a month, 1 week, you flip on your beam propulsions, Paklanov beam propulsion unit. And that would take you up to 200 C. And so you're here at 2.2 months through the travel. And at that point, you do your deceleration. So you point your device in the opposite direction to decelerate. And finally, you're at Alpha Centauri within 2.5 months with this technique. They're comparing various. Also, if you take Brown's saucers that he was getting vertical thrust, and you take 2 of them and you work them together with a coil, sort of a tank circuit. So these are the capacitors, and you have a coil. You can oscillate these to alternately charge one or the other. And what you do is you polarize this barium titanate, this dielectric, to the same potential that you're using to with the AC. So when you superimpose the AC on that, it's going from 0 to 2, twice the voltage. So you see what I mean? Because you've polarized this, on one cycle, it's canceling out the polarization. On the other cycle, it's enhancing it to twice. So this is a way where you can conserve energy and at the same time pulse this, because Brown was saying that you need to pulse these things. They don't work if you just use standard DC. Okay. So here's your tank circuit, where this would be your saucer here. You could also use microwave oscillator on your negative electrode. That's another way of doing that. The military has gone that way. They use microwave oscillators of very high power. Now, well, I have 5 minutes left. Let's see if I can get through this. I just want to mention 1985 began writing a series of draft chapters for a book that was to be about gravity control. This was the predecessor of my book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. It was published in 2008. One chapter in this 1985 draft, in one of these chapters, I had set down ideas giving details of a design and principle of operation for an anti-gravity craft that is almost identical to what the Navy scientist Paillas patented over 30 years later, 2018 and 19, and which may be the technology behind the Tic Tac UFO that everyone's aware of. For my own reasons, I had not included this material in my book, but I'll go through this. Here's the chapter, beginning of the chapter, called The Manipulation of Gravity. And this was in 1985. I just learned at that time about electrogravitics. I managed to get citation about it into my subquantum kinetics paper that was published in the Referee Journal. It was the same year I discovered the electrogravitic system study, which I got from Wright Patterson. And all this material inspired me to develop this idea. Lenticular craft, where both the outer hulls were negatively charged, but they're separate. The upper hull is separate from the lower hull. And you pulse, you're putting pulses of charge onto each one that causes the ether around the craft to bias. You're creating virtual charge around the craft, if you understand this concept. In other words, standard charge would have electrons are anti-gravitic, so they create a gravity hill. But by pulsing this, you are in effect polarizing the ether. You're creating a gravity hill just outside the craft. And by pulsing the lower hull faster than the upper hull, even though they're both maybe charged to about the same potential, you're able to create a much larger virtual gravitationally repulsive potential under the craft to cause it to lift. You could also do this with positive, but where the positive is attracting upward. But the problem is positive charges would be attracted to the Earth. You would want to be putting negative charges in your craft to be gravity repulsive. Now, Brown did not suggest this. This is my idea. It did not come out of his theory because he didn't have really the electrogravitics theory of subquantum kinetics. This is what makes all this reasoning possible. Here's some other pages from this study. I discussed this also in my APEC presentation. I called this the Aquarian monopolar elevator, and I preferred the design on the left where you have the negative charges on the outside. And here we'll note some points. I'll move this down here. It has the advantage of applying voltage to the positive and negative electrodes. That if you do this, an electrostatic potential may be generated in the capacitor's environment that is exclusively of one sign, monopolar. So here I'm talking about charge in the ether. I didn't use here the particular words of virtual charge, but that's what really describes it. Polarity outside of the craft. That's the key here. And I'm saying about how the faster you pulse the hull, the more increase of this virtual potential you'll be getting outside the craft. So by pulsing the bottom of the craft faster than the top, you get a lift. So he says here, the beauty of this monopolar design is in order to establish a vertical field gradient, gravity gradient across the craft, the upper and lower hulls need not be charged at different voltages as done in a bipolar design. Rather, hulls need only be pulsed at different frequencies. Thus, by supplying the same voltage to both upper and lower hull capacitors, a net zero potential difference would be maintained between the craft's upper and lower surfaces. And down here it says the monopolar design also has the advantage that the degree of lift may be controlled simply by differentially changing the excitation frequency. If you wonder why people hear UFOs humming, what they're hearing is the beat frequency between the upper and lower hulls. So if you increase the pulsing frequency on the lower hull, you get increased repulsive thrust. When you accelerate, the pulsation frequency difference between the upper and lower hulls increases progressively. And you get a beat frequency that progressively increases in pitch. When you're decelerating, the opposite happens. Your beat frequency is progressively decreasing in pitch. And when you're hovering, the pulsing frequency difference is almost the same, but it's a very low pitch. So you get that very low wobble when it's hovering. So here it shows more clearly with plotting of gravity potential. Here I took out the other negative electrode and just have the inner hull be positive. This is interesting that it acts like a shield, inertial shield, because you don't see the outside world. The gravity field of the Earth is diverted around your craft. If you think of a Geon flux is what creates the gravity field of the Earth, that flux is repelled by the craft and goes around, so it never passes through the craft. So when this is accelerating, your only reference is the positive electrogravitic charge on the hull of the inside of the craft, which is pulling you to the floor to some extent. So you can do, 100 G accelerations without a problem. So here's your negative virtual mass in the ether above and your positive below, which is greater, and that's why it would take off. Also, I was saying that it could be regarded as a sacred technology. I think it's a wrong mental attitude to view this as, oh, we're going to fight battles with this stuff. This stuff is beautiful. It's sacred technology. When you're inside, the flow of time speeds up. That's the anti-gravitational time dilation effect, because you're going the opposite direction. Also, occupants can become invisible to outside observers. You've heard a lot about these craft having invisibility characteristics, because you'd have gravitational lensing of light would be diverted around the craft. Also, you have a mild Philadelphia experiment effect going on where it could cause partial dematerialization of molecules inside the craft. Not to the point that it would cause you any harm, but it could cause a transparent effect, like in the Philadelphia experiment where the ship disappeared. And it could affect the consciousness of those piloting these craft. So these are things to consider. Here's an experiment we did with showing a negative charge being applied to a particle. In other words, negative being an X hill. So here the particle materializes, suddenly dematerializes when it's exposed to the negative charge. So that's what would go on, as a tendency to dematerialize. Now here's the Navy patent called the High Frequency Gravitational Wave Generator by Hgs. And it's essentially what I have shown you there, is double hull. They don't say that the outer hull is negative. They don't disclose that. That's important information they never let out in the patent. But it has to be for this to be practical. Instead of doing it with like coils and capacitor type of thing that I was suggesting back in '85, they're using microwaves to create shock fronts, microwave shock fronts. And so they have microwave emitters here. They have a microwave sound generator here, piezoelectric sound generators. This thing would spin. This could be much smaller. It could be maybe only a foot in diameter, this whole thing. Whereas this craft could be as big as the room you're in, or bigger. Here's the power unit. So this is supposed to spin for some reason, not too apparent. Somehow trying to create vortical waves, I think. Torsional waves, as they call them. Here's a picture of the craft. Pius patent. This is he calls this a resonator cavity, where the microwaves are oscillating. And he says, due to the effect of the microwaves, he's polarizing the vacuum around the craft. That's the terms. He stays within the terminology of standard physics to refer to the vacuum potential. So this is exactly what I was saying in '85, that you're creating virtual charge in the ether around the craft. He's just using a different terminology. And he's talking in the patent, if you read it, how this is what propels the craft, this polarized vacuum. Causing the outer resonant cavity wall to vibrate and create a local polarized vacuum outside the outer resonant cavity wall. To move upwards, the top portion and the top leading edge portion and top trailing edge portion of the resonant cavity would be vibrated, thereby causing polarized vacuum field to move the craft upward. So here he's talking about differential effects using differential pulsing to a microwave pulsing. So essentially what I was saying in the figure 38A, that I showed you earlier. Here they say this is a lot of microphysics, quantum mumbo jumbo. If you say, when he says vacuum polarization, this translates as virtual G-Hill potential induction in subquantum kinetics. Then you can understand what's going on, because vacuum polarization is just BS in standard physics. Relativity, they're trying to stick with relativity, and it just does not explain this. So we're talking about an ether negative virtual charge being created. And I learned from the contact that I had with, who was working in the whistleblower from the Black Projects. He says, in the Black Projects, they use the term field-induced soliton phenomenon to describe this effect of building up this, this virtual charge around the craft. So it's through repetitive pulsing. Think of the pulses are like pumps, ether pumps, and you keep pumping the ether in a certain direction. You're pumping geons, let's say, outward from the craft hull, and you're creating a geon hill outside the craft hull. And if your geon hill that you're creating below the craft's greater, you're going to go up. A reference to repulsive gravity effect would imply the use of a negative charge. In other words, in the patent, they refer to repulsive gravity effect. So they're talking about charging the hull negatively, like I suggested. And here's more non-equilibrium thermodynamics mumbo jumbo. They actually talk about like Prigogine stuff here. So they're almost getting into subquantum kinetics in their patent. Here they say about no inertial communication with the outside world. And I agree entirely. If it's designed this way, you have no inertial communication. Here's the claims. You want to read the patent. They also have this, it's a repulsor beam. They can create a beam, a repulsion beam. This is a dome electrode. They charge to a negative voltage. They don't say that, but it's negative. They use up to 3 million volts if it's in air, 1 billion if it's in the vacuum space. And they use like a Van de Graaff type Pelletier belt generator here to generate the voltage. Then they spin this whole dome at 30,000 RPM. And they say that this material, it holds a charge. They call it C-ply material. It has a K factor of 10 to the 18th. If they're serious, I mean, that is incredible. That's a billion K factor. I mean, I've never heard of anything that high. Most of the stuff in civilian domain is like 20,000, K factor 20,000, maybe 50,000. So they've somehow cracked, made a breakthrough and developed materials of that high so that they can store enormous charges. They claim 50,000 coulombs per square meter they store on this. And why do they spin it? Well, that's because by spinning it, you create your repulsions. By the way, this is pulsed. They have this is piezoelectric, so they cause it to pulse outward. So they're creating outward pulsations, but if they spin it, those pulsations will be collimated in along the axis of the spin axis. So in effect, they are producing a unit similar to Plekhanov's. So the Russians have Plekhanov's beam, and we have Pius's beam, and both can be used for repelling asteroids. So Pius talks about repelling asteroids in his patent. So here to tail off, we have unconventional ether physics, which causes gravity control, free energy. With the use of that, we develop a secret off-planet civilization funded by deficit creating black projects, which has no benefit to terrestrial civilization. On the other hand, our terrestrial civilizations are left with sanctioned conventional physics, conventional engineering, leaves us earthbound, petrol guzzling, polluting technologies, rockets, jets, automobiles, and trains. And now the current strategy is disclosure, and the Navy is trying to make the effort to let us know more about the unconventional technologies so we can slowly introduce them and get off of this baloney down here, which we've been frozen into for decades. It's about time. So there we have it. I'm a little over. Huh? I went over 15 minutes.
That's fine. Paul, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, Paul, thanks very much for that. It was a fascinating presentation and quite a lot to take in. If everyone's okay to, and you're okay for questions, I'll throw it open now if everyone would like to unmute themselves. I don't think I managed to mute anybody anyway, so, but please, if you have been muted, unmute and feel free to ask some questions. Paul, if I could start really, I had a couple of little questions which hopefully are reasonably easy for you. When you started at the beginning, you were talking about Thomas Townsend Brown's work with these little discs. And I just wondered whether this has been repeated recently by anybody.
Yes, like these things here.
Yeah.
Kim Zorzi has made a small model with 3-inch discs and got to go quite rapidly around. I saw his demonstration at the space conference in Texas, where I was attending. Zorzi is quite unique guy, inventor.
Yeah.
And his version is better. I've seen other versions, but they don't go as fast as his. Also, Brown's pendulum experiment has been repeated by Patrick Cornell, and he's published in refereed scientific journals and established that indeed it does violate Newton's third law. And he gives his version an explanation of how it might be working. So all this stuff, it has been verified, at least not to the extent Brown had done, but you know, people working out of their garage. Yeah.
And later on, when you were talking about the recent patents and the work was done for the Navy, was that right? Was that in relation to the stealth bomber, the B-2? When it refers to B-2, is that the stealth bomber?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And you still there?
Yeah. Can you see me?
I can see you. Yeah.
I just it took off
my
my screen share.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, yeah, what I was interested in, you talk about the dielectric material, and you mentioned barium titanate as being one of the best ones to use. Was that used on the stealth bomber, do you know, or was that a different material?
Well, it's highly classified. They don't say what it's made out of.
Okay.
When I was working,
so we can only speculate.
There was a guy who was in the same class as I was, being trained at the patent office, who had worked on the Northrop project with the B-2 bomber. And we were soon befriended by a guy who was intelligence. You could see from his, just to make sure he didn't spill any beans to me, because they knew I was into this stuff. I published on this topic. But yes, logical. I mean, just logically, you would want to make it out of a high K material, whether it's barium titanate or some super, what they call C-ply material that they've engineered. They've got billions of dollars probably put into just engineering capacitance material to be able to put huge charges, because the more charge they can put on the surface of the B2, the more it's like a feather, floating like a feather in the sky.
I mean, in Nick Cook's book, he mentions depleted uranium. Would that be appropriate or not?
No.
As a dielectric, no.
No, he's thinking in terms of Brown's old experiments with the pendulum experiment to put something massive like lead or depleted uranium. You could put.
I was going to ask a question, Paul. As
Because
regards,
depleted uranium doesn't have a high K. If you could get a depleted uranium that was extremely high K, fine, okay.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Sorry, Brendan, you far away.
Go ahead,
I was going to say, as regards high voltages, you can. Is it right that you can get high voltages from a low power? So low wattage. If you just make the voltage very high, you can have the current very small. So you can use
So you want high voltages. So the higher the voltage, the more charge you get on your plates.
Yeah, so the wattage, the power of wattage doesn't have to be very high. It can be like 45 watts of a bulb. But if you make the voltage...
No, you don't see any effect under 30,000 volts. So ideally, you want to be up at least 100,000 volts if you were experimenting with stuff.
But I was just making the point that when you've got high voltage, like 500,000 volts, you could get that out of a 45 watt bulb if you just made the current very, very small.
Oh, yeah.
Make the voltage very high. So you could use the wattage of a bulb might even be able to lift a table, because you're putting a very high voltage, but a very small current of only 45 watts of say, electric bulb, that kind of scenario.
Well, Brown doesn't report lifting tables. His small craft that I showed you that was lifting 10% extra of its weight itself was probably like a aluminum pie pan weight of, I don't know, a few ounces in weight. These were for tests, but theoretically, if you scale this up, you're talking about big things. With the method that I show in my 1985 paper by pulsing that, you could use, for example, microwave transmitter on the negative electrode of like that Brown's parabolic lifter, and arrange it to somehow resonate with the whole unit. If you could get a state of resonance, you could probably get it to lift considerable weights. Now, what we know is just sort of scratched from here and there, from stuff leaked. Brown was very tight-lipped about this. He didn't publish any of this stuff except openly in a patent. But he didn't go too much into the electrogravitics stuff in his patent.
Did he have a theory? Did he have a theory of an ether theory, or was he working with experiments?
He had an ether theory that involved where in the ether, it was the ether of dielectric effect, the permeability and dielectric constant was somehow a property of an ether. And by varying this, he could get somehow varying forces developed that would affect gravitational forces. But it's sort of hand waving, He was, he had the feeling the ether was important, but he didn't have subquantum kinetics. He passed away when, not very long after subquantum kinetics was published. He may still have been alive in '85. but then he passed away shortly after that. But that was a big revelation when I discovered his work. You know, I was so relieved that, you know, here was something subquantum kinetics was predicting, and Brown had done all this work. In fact, they've got these secret space programs developing this. And virtually you hear nothing about it in the physics class. You know, it's like what Forrestal was saying. Most of the stuff they teach us in the universities is BS. I hate to say, you know, I have a totally different perspective on physical reality than your average graduate student from university graduate student. I have migrated in stages, you know, over 30 years. So I'm trying to share from a different, my own different perspective, a little part of my views.
Paul, you mentioned also during the talk the 12 predictions that subquantum kinetics. You mentioned one of them. Could you let us know what some of the others were? What was just as an example?
Okay, you know, they're all listed on my website. If you go to etheric.com or starburstfound.org, there's tabs that take you to the predictions, and it gives detailed explanations of each one, when I predicted it, when it was confirmed by stuff that came out later. One example is the shape of the proton and neutrons field charge structure. That was found in 2001 by particle scattering experiments done in Virginia. And they found exactly that there was a dome shape to the middle, and that there was a wave pattern, about Compton wavelength pattern surrounding that. And that the neutron was, that wave pattern was hugging the equilibrium level, whereas in the proton, that was all biased upward, just like in my diagram.
Kelly's charge distribution.
So that's one example, you know. It would, I could go into more, but there was another question. Will?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk, Paul. I was wondering if you could comment on, I'm not sure, you know, the Boyd-Bushman effect, or this guy has talked about putting.
I only have heard of Boyd-Bushman. Which effect are you referring to?
So he talks about a mass reduction when putting the two north poles of a magnet together. Or when you tape them together, then it falls slower if it's dropped from a building than if they were not taped together. And I was wondering if you could comment on that from a subquantum kinetics perspective. Like, is it when you put two magnetic fields of the same sign together, does it increase the rate of ether consumption? Like when you force.
Well, first of all, I don't know if we should call it Boyd-Bushman, because I know Kelly was doing that years back in the 80s. He was doing experiments dropping magnets from with a stepladder and observing the difference. I don't know when Bushman was doing his experiments, but you can think of the magnetic field as like a spin vortex in the ether. And in fact, in a group that Brendan has developed there, the Model G vortical motion group, we're trying to computer simulate this to show how the particle could evolve a vortical flux around its axis that would be equivalent to spin, and that would be the origin of magnetism. So if you have a motional electrostatic field, think of it, for the magnetic aspect, because you don't have magnetic fields per se in subquantum kinetics. You have motional electric fields and gravity fields. Those are rooted in the etheric equivalents, the G and the XY. So it's feasible, if there's electrogravitic connection, that magnetic effects are associated with gravitational effects too. In other words, emotional gravity field. So you're not only dragging the electric field around, you're dragging a G field around, creating a gravity vortex. And what does that do? That causes a spin effect. So the geons that are coming into the Earth vertically encounter your magnet and they get spun out. And they don't pass through the magnet as easily. Of course, they're still passing through the magnet, but a lot of them get spun out. And this could be the basis of a lot of the UFO technologies where they talk about spinning massive, like Mercury inside the craft, this sort of thing. Searle disk was doing this, I believe. In my book, I discuss the Searle disk. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can go to other predictions if I open up to remind me. As you know, I just don't keep all this in my head. But the redshift, cosmological redshift, was another prediction that came out of this. And actually, that was the second one that I tested.
Pioneer 10, blue shifting. Pioneer 10 signal blue shifting.
Yeah, the blue shift predicted the Pioneer 10 effect. You've all heard of the Pioneer effect, where they found that the microwave signals coming back from the spacecraft were slightly higher frequency than going out. And of course, there's a lot of debate whether there was a force of the spacecraft due to its engines, its heat source. But before they even looked at that, I had contacted JPL, and because I found out they have ways of doing precise measurements of microwave frequency in their work that they're doing. So I called them up and I asked them, have you ever seen frequency shift of microwave signals when you transpond your signals? Coming back, there's slightly higher frequency. And they said, no. But they found it an interesting idea. And 5-6 years later, suddenly they're coming out with this study. They claim that they have discovered it. No mention of my name. Somewhere I talk about the whole sequence of events. I think in the predictions section, I talk about that. That was one of my predictions, basically. And I even sent them my book. The guy, after he published, I sent him my book. And again, he didn't mention me in the second publication he came out. That's what we're up against. The standard reviews are so strong that any alternative views gets totally screened out, even if you predicted them, even if you tipped them off to the ideas.
And you'd also said there had been thousands of papers written trying to explain the blue shifting of Pioneer 10, and none of them have been able to explain it properly.
But the real proof of the blue shifting effect is in cosmology. You see photons are blue shifted when they go through the Virgo cluster, and they conclude we're moving towards the Virgo cluster. Well, it's due to this blue shifting effect. You have what's called the finger of God's effect. Since you're in astronomy, you must have heard fingers of God effect.
Yep.
When they plot redshifts of a galaxy cluster in redshift space, so they create a map. So the redshifted, the blue shifted galaxies in the cluster are at negative velocities, and the redshifted you go progressively up to higher velocities. And they form a diagram which looks like as a finger pointed towards Earth. And this is, any cluster out there will show this, and that's why I call it fingers of God effect. Well, all these fingers are pointing at us. And you can easily explain it if there's a blue shifting of photons. And then I've shown planetary stellar mass luminosity relationship. I discussed this with one of the pioneers in the field of mass luminosity relationships. His name slips me. I said, I found that if you plot the planets, masses and their internal luminosities on the same graph as the red dwarf stars, that they line up on the same line. And he found that very interesting. He said, I don't believe anybody has done that. Well, they hadn't done it because they didn't expect it made any sense to do that. But subquantum kinetics was saying, well, if there's blue shifting in galaxy clusters, including the Milky Way, that we're in a over unity region.
Was that the one? Was that the one there?
Supercritical region. Yeah, there's the graph. You see, it's a log-log plot of the mass luminosity redshifts, mass luminosity relation of the red dwarf stars. I took and I extended that downward, and it went right through Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus. And then later, when the brown dwarf results came out, I started plotting them, and they lined up too, although they were not as confined. They were little boxes, essentially. So those are a few of the predictions. It completely changes all of astronomy because it's assumed that red dwarfs are run by fusion, or if they're brown dwarfs, is due to heating of the heat accumulated in the body. But it doesn't make any sense that those two would line on the same line, you know, because it can't be either one or the other in that case. So if you have blue shifting, it explains both. Until you get to the sun. Now the sun is on the upper main sequence. So why do you have the lower and the upper main sequence? Did anyone give that some thought? It's not explained, really, except some hand waving after the fact. They know, they see it, and they try to explain it after the fact. Well, it's very simple. That's where fusion power kicks in. You know, at a certain threshold, fusion kicks in and it adds to the blue shifting effect. And so you get a steeper ML relation at that point. So this totally revises all of your physics, but we're getting off in astronomy and other areas now.
It'll have to go. We'll have to do it another time. But Paul, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating evening. A lot of food for thought there, and so many thanks. And thank you all for coming along. So we'll close the meeting just now, and hope to see some of you in a couple of days' time.
I was just Andrew, I was just going to say one thing. Professor David Bohm, the physicist David Bohm, was saying, also had views that weren't the same as the conventional, was saying, why can't physics be pluralistic? Why can't we have many different types of theories studied, not just one conventional theory, many different types of ones, some that are unconventional, studied together? You know, that'd be one way of compromise. Well,
whatever, I mean, as an interim, but I see subquantum kinetics will be the physics eventually of the future if it continues to survive. The only thing that stops it is there's no money coming into helping us. Brendan's doing this out of pocket pretty much, and the group of volunteers. Nobody has paid me anything to develop this over the last 35, 40 years. Imagine if suddenly Quantum Financial System grants $2 million to Starburst, and we can start really getting us off the ground and go to 20 million after that.
You need to get Jeff Bezos put some money your way, I think. Yeah.
And also, you might be able to make medicine out of the subquantum kinetics. Would have new properties that you'd be able to make new more advanced medicine out of as well. It's not just
Medicine,
Free
I
energy.
don't see that, but Randall Mills claims to make new compounds out of his hydrinos. And so that's another area subquantum kinetics explains the hydrino effect that Mills has discovered, because you're allowed to have orbits below the ground state in hydrogen. That's something that's impossible with standard quantum mechanics.
And that was a so-called over unity energy, wasn't it, Paul?
Well, he's got a million watt unit that's fits on a tabletop, you know. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you all once again, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Okay,
Thank you, Paul. Thanks.
thanks,
Well
Paul.
done.
Yeah, many thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers for now.
Okay.
Cheers, then. Bye.
Bye.